Thank you very much. So the title is, which is also the thesis, that marriage is a natural kind. Of course, then you want to know natural kind of what? It's a natural kind of relationships, right? Just like mammal is a natural kind of animal, and marriage is a natural kind of relationship. So first I'll say a little bit about what how I think of natural kinds and how there might be natural kinds of relationships. Then I'll give what I think is the main alternative to a view of marriage as a natural kind, namely a social construction view of marriage, on which society puts together a package of rights and responsibilities and calls it marriage. And then I'll give some arguments for the main thesis, mostly by way of beating up on the alternative in our usual analytic philosopher fashion. None of these arguments are knockdown arguments, I think. I think they give a more powerful case together than that any of them does separately. The idea is that there's some facts about marriage that are well explained by the thesis that marriage is a natural kind. So first I'll look at some cross-cultural identification. I'll give an argument based on the fact that we can discover new rights and responsibilities within marriage. I will talk about cross-cultural critique of marriage. Talk of marriage as possibly the fulfillment of a natural desire. Then I'll give one argument just for conservatives and one just for liberals. So I doubt anybody will be convinced by both of these. But if they are, I don't know what to say. I guess, yeah. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how Wittgensteinian, how tempering the social constitution view with a dose of Wittgensteinian family resemblance helps get out of some of these arguments, but not all of them. And so overall, there's still a case to be made that marriage is a natural kind. Okay. So I wish I knew what natural kinds were. There are lots of philosophers of science who wish they knew what natural kinds were. But even though I don't know what they are, I can give you some plausible characteristics of them. The natural kinds are genuinely explanatory. Natural kind terms occur in genuine explanations, right? So we say, this is green because it's an emerald. And the fact that it's an emerald is, well, that's an important part of how this is explanatory, right? We could make gerrymandered terms, like something that is an emerald if it's earlier than 2100, and a diamond if it's past 2100, and we could say, this is green because it's one of those. That's not a good explanation, because this gerrymandered thing is not a natural kind. So there's something natural about natural kinds in the David Lewis sense. They're not gerrymandered, and this has something to do with their being genuinely explanatory. What's the fundamental thing that makes them natural kinds? I don't know. Is it not being gerrymandered? Is it they're being genuinely explanatory? I don't know. But all of these seem, but this seems to be one major characteristic of natural kinds, right? The explanations are often non-normative, right? So here's Rover has 4 legs because Rover is a dog. This is green because it's a diamond. We give these in biology, physics, and all over the place, these kinds of things. But interestingly, I think this is a lesson from Aristotle. There's normative facts we can explain using natural kinds. Rover should have 4 legs because Rover is a dog. That kind of explanation could find its way in biology, not much in contemporary biology, maybe somewhat in contemporary medicine, but not so much as in the past. But definitely it doesn't seem to find its way into physics. I don't know if that's a deficiency on the physics or if that's just how the physical things are. Maybe the physical things are ones where the way they are is the way they should be, and so there's really no further should be to be explained. But in any case, this is a genuine explanation. This is a genuine explanation of natural that employs a natural kind. natural kinds enable inductive inference. Right? Rover and Fido are dogs. Rover has 4 legs, and that's evidence that Fido has 4 legs as well. Certainly far from conclusive evidence if it's just 2 cases, but there's some evidence there. Whereas if we're dealing with some gerrymandered, non-natural kind, not much evidence, right? So take the non-natural kind, diamond or emerald. Fido is a diamond or emerald. Fido is green. Rover is a diamond or emerald. Therefore, Rover is green. No, not a very good inference. At least, maybe it's still, there's something to it, but it's got a lot less force. So they don't, I think natural kinds not only enable inductive inferences, they make them go smoothly and well. They capture genuine similarity, right? This may be why they enable inductive inference, right? So the fact that 2 things have in common the property of being a diamond or emerald doesn't capture any genuine similarity between them, or not much. Maybe the fact that they're both minerals or something, but nothing at the level of being an emerald or diamond. But natural kinds capture genuine similarities. If Rover and Fido are dogs, that's a genuine similarity they have. And then I want to say something that is controversial in the natural kind literature, but maybe you could take as somewhat stipulative of how I want to use the word natural kind, that the genuine similarity they capture is not one constituted by how we contingently think about the items under consideration. So for example, famous case in philosophy of science, jade was discovered to be a disjunction of 2 minerals, jadeite and nephrite. Now you could say, still, being jade is a genuine kind of similarity in light of the fact that both serve similar artistic roles in human culture. But that's not that kind of similarity isn't the kind of similarity I'll be looking for in a natural kind. That's one based on the contingent arrangement of our thinking about it and our using both jadeite and nephrite for similar artistic purposes because they lend themselves well to similar artistic purposes, but in fact their mineral structure is quite different. So jade is not going to be a natural kind because its similarity is a social similarity. Maybe the thought about what the kind of similarity that we want in natural kind is it's intrinsic, whereas the social one is extrinsic. It's imposed by the fact that we use the 2 minerals for similar purposes, namely for making jade statuettes. So I don't know. I don't know if maybe this thing is a little bit ad hoc. If so, then it's stipulative. But I'll want to include this. Okay, definition of natural kinds. I can't give you one, but then we've sort of learned to live with that. Any interesting concept that's not merely completely stipulative, we probably can't give a definition of anyway, so that's fine. We all have sort of examples in mind for this. So let me talk a little bit more. A natural kind is a type, okay? It has tokens or instances that fall under it, right? So a dog, the natural kind, has tokens like Fido and Rover. The instances could be substance-like, and many of the natural kinds that first come to mind, that's what we've got. We've got substance-like instances. So here are some kinds like that: vertebrate, dog, water, globular cluster, tectonic plate. All these things. The things that fall under them either are substances or at least are like substances. I think some of us Aristotelians will say things like that maybe tectonic plates aren't really substances, but they're very much substance-like. And the like part would worry me if this was the only thing there is, but really I think natural kind is very broad and crosses boundaries of categories, because I think you also have event or process-like natural kinds, and those are ones we don't as often talk of as natural kinds, but I think they genuinely are natural kinds. Earthquake, tornado, combustion, mitosis, cohesion, sentinel behavior. I put a question mark behind that. Maybe that's constructed by societies that have by, say, meerkat societies or something. Maybe it is natural. The process-like natural kinds will sometimes, might well have a significant dispositional component. My example here was sentinel behavior in meerkats, where the meerkat stands on a high thing looking for danger. And crucial part of that is not that he's standing there and slightly moving his head. It's that he is disposed to sound the alarm. And I don't know how they actually sound the alarm, or at least run down, and everybody else notices that he's run down and they jump into their holes, right? So the dispositional component in this case is central to its being sentinel behavior, right? It's not just flicking its neck from side to side. Some of these a lot of these cases do not have as much of a dispositional component, but I think we should recognize that there might be process-like natural kinds that have a dispositional component. And then I think relationships are token processes, are processes between individuals with significant dispositional components, right? Any relationships, really, whether they are of love or of hate or friendship or enmity or utility. There's some kind of process involving multiple individuals, significant dispositional components. If they're interpersonal relationships, there will be psychological components and so on. But this is just sort of rough ontology where relationships fit. They're tokens of process types. And I think some relationship types are socially constituted. The congressman-constituent relationship token is socially constituted. It's constructed. We have defined that a particular set of rights and responsibilities and patterns of behavior as defining that. But I suspect, and I will argue in one particular case, that there are natural kinds of relationship types. I think the parent-child relationship has a very good case to be made for its being a natural kind of relationship and a natural kind of process involving two or three individuals. Okay. I think this is not too controversial, that marriage as a kind of relationship, the concept of marriage, provides both normative and non-normative explanations. Why are they arguing like that? Because they're married, right? That's a non-normative explanation. Why shouldn't they argue like that? Because they're married, right? So we have both normative and non-normative explanations that involve marriage. So that's one of the characteristics of a natural kind. Second one, I think we can engage in inductive reasoning about marriage, and we understand those of us who are married understand our own relationship better by observing the relationships of others, and sometimes we can help others understand theirs by giving our own example. There's inductive reasoning. This inductive reasoning can lead to both normative conclusions as well as non-normative ones, right? You observe the harmfulness of certain ways of interacting across a number of married couples, and you conclude this is not appropriate to marriage in general, and hence not appropriate to my marriage. But you can also have non-normative things, as in observing the particular ways in which married couples, say, argue or make up or do other things together. So, two characteristics of natural kinds are, I think, in place. I think there are genuine similarities between marriages, but that one is a little bit trickier because we know there's a lot of cross-cultural differences, right? We certainly are going to get genuine similarities between marriages if we cut out outlying cases that don't fit, like maybe child marriages or maybe green card marriages, things that don't seem prototypical. And that feels like it's cheating to cut out some cases in order to get similarity. What do I mean by cut out? Cut out and say that's not really marriage. That's just called marriage. That's marriage in name only, maybe. So maybe that's a little cheating to do this. And I also said you get these similarities maybe more clearly if you focus on normative, on what the rights and obligations actually are, as opposed to just on what the observed behaviors are. So I'm a little worried about the cheating and cutting out outlying cases. The danger is that I'm making the similarity thesis unfalsifiable if I'm willing to say, oh, no, you think that's not a counterexample to the similarity thesis because that's not really marriage, if I'm willing to say that all the time. But on the other hand, that's the kind of important thing to do in science. We do, in fact, cut out cases and say, no, we were wrong about the natural kind dog doesn't include foxes. Their characteristics just don't count. We may have initially thought foxes were a kind of dog. No, we see they're kind of an outlier from the dog point of view. So I think it's not entirely a cheat. I think it's can be responsibly done. So we've got three or two and a half of the characteristics of a natural kind: explanation, induction, genuine similarity. Why did I say two and a half? Because I said that in my genuine similarity characteristic, I said not socially constructed. And that's the part I don't have as yet. So I think so far, this gives a pretty plausible argument that marriage is a natural kind unless it's socially constructed. So what I've got for most of the rest of this talk is just some discussion of this last half step, this social construction thing. So are the similarities just there because society has put in place similar institutions that it's constructed? Okay, so is it? Well, I'll offer my 6 arguments, of which I expect at most 5 will appeal to any person. So here's one. Typically, countries recognize marriages undertaken in other countries. There's an exception, right? Same-sex marriages are undertaken in one country, will often not be recognized by some other countries. And non-binary marriages undertaken in some countries will not be recognized in other countries. So for example, immigrants from a polygamous society to the US will at the border have to choose which of the multiple spouses is going to count as their US spouse. And so, yes, there's an exception to this, but there's a kind of typical recognition. But the rights and responsibilities that people attach to marriage or hold to be attached to marriage differ widely from culture to culture. Right? Think of especially things like authority structures within marriage and how much they differ. Even things like expectations of sexual fidelity will differ. So there seem to be wide differences in the rights and responsibilities people think are attached to marriage. Suppose marriage is socially constructed, right? I almost always argue things by reductio. Direct arguments are just not my thing. Well, if it's socially constructed, then it's going to, social constructions are defined by the rights and responsibilities and similar and other normative statuses assigned to it by the society. And normally people are right about what rights and responsibilities and normative statuses they have assigned to it in a given culture. That's not. It seems like the rights and responsibilities assigned to a social construction are the ones held to be assigned to it. So, if we have two cultures that hold different rights and responsibilities to be attached to marriage, then almost surely different rights and responsibilities are attached to marriage in the two cultures, assuming a construction view. But since it seems like relationship types and institutions on a construction view are defined by the rights and responsibilities. They're packages of rights and responsibilities and other normative statuses. It follows that in that case, marriage sub one culture is different from marriage sub the other culture. It's a different relationship, perhaps with the same name if they share a language, or if they don't share a language with a name that for some historical, pragmatic reasons we chose to translate as marriage into English. Hence, either we should not recognize the marriage of some other culture when that culture is not ours, or we should warn people who are married in that other culture at the border that their entry constitutes a wedding. Because they were previously married sub Poland, say, and now they will be married sub USA, right? Either don't recognize and say they're not really married, or say, stop, think about this, do you really want to marry this person by entering the US? If we have a construction view, I think these are it is not plausible that we would have to do either one of these. And in light of the fact that it's not plausible, I reject the premise that marriage is socially constructed. Right? I don't know. Maybe you could think this is not so highly implausible, maybe some kind of a warning that the social expectations are different is good. You might think that people before traveling should already sort of get to know how things are in a different country and should know that there will be different expectations for how they treat their spouses. Maybe. Still, I think prima facie this is not a plausible story. It seems like we can say you have marriage in multiple cultures. Even though people hold different rights and responsibilities to be attached to it, and this suggests that the rights and responsibilities they hold to be attached to it either don't define, either the relationship is not defined by the rights and responsibilities, or the rights and responsibilities that people in different cultures attach to it, they may be wrong about. And that's what we would expect in a natural kind case. In a natural kind case, people can be wrong about what falls under a natural kind, what components a natural kind has, how natural kinds behave. Okay. Second, I think this one, I think the first three are actually closely related. This is something, people in good marriages continue to discover new rights and responsibilities. I wrote in good marriages, but I'm actually thinking this may actually be even more true sometimes in bad marriages. People may discover they have new rights. They discover rights that they did not know about by noticing that they are being violated by the other person. So both in good and bad marriages, people continue to discover new rights and responsibilities. And I think they're not merely learning something about the rights and responsibilities society has instituted. There are no secret treaties here in the way that you could learn something about the law by finding that the government has these secret treaties, and somewhere there's this secret societal definition of marriage, and we somehow manage to get glimpses of it the longer we are married. That doesn't seem plausible. But it's exactly the kind of thing we would expect if marriage were a natural kind. We would expect to come to a better and better understanding of that kind and its behavior and the kinds of things it explains and implies. We had access to natural kind water for however long humanity's been around, let's say 200, 300,000 years, maybe more, maybe less. And quite recently, we've learned that it's H2O, right? Now, here's an objection. Maybe when people in marriages discover new rights and responsibilities, maybe other kinds of normative statuses than rights and responsibilities, they're learning the logical consequences of rights and responsibilities that we all know the particular society has instituted. So for instance, in Western cultures, typically one of the ones that is held is that people should love each other in a marriage. And maybe people are just learning what logically follows from loving each other. Maybe. But it still seems to me that the subject of reflection when people learn about marriage is the couple's joint love together. That is what they are reflecting on, not the social expectations. And secondly, I can say, yeah, that's an alternative answer as to what's going on. But the natural kind story is going to give us a unified story about multiple phenomena. The discovery phenomenon is only one of many. So that's kind of a bit of a cop-out if that's the best answer to this objection. But nonetheless, if I can find a unified explanation of multiple phenomena, that's better than giving piecemeal ones. And this one seems to be a kind of piecemeal one just for the discovery one. Third one, closely related, we've got Albonia, a very patriarchal society, and Jim ignores his wife Alicia's emotional needs because the society prescribes that he ignore her emotional needs. It says that if you have emotional needs, it's because you're a weakling. A husband should not give in to the weakness of his wife, and only, on the other hand, maybe the emotional needs of the husband do matter because husbands are expected to be weak or something. Who knows? Make up some kind of story. It doesn't have to be consistent. It doesn't have to be very good, right? Just make it up. So we've got our Albanian who ignores his wife's emotional needs. And I think he's being a bad husband by ignoring his wife's emotional needs. But on the construction view, he can say, I'm not a bad husband. I am a husband of Albania, and a good one at that. Look how I neglect my wife's emotional needs. That is what husbands of Albania do. That is the institution I have joined. That is the institution she has joined. I am good at this. On this view, then, I think we can still criticize marriage of Albania, right? We can criticize that institution, and we can say it's a relationship nobody should enter into. And we can criticize Jim for entering into this relationship, and we can maybe even, depending on whether the women are free to enter into are making free choices in that society in these cases, we may criticize Alicia for entering into this relationship with Jim. We can do that, but that is different from the criticism that I think we want to make, is that Jim is being a bad husband. Moreover, if we do this, if we just criticize the relationship, namely criticize the fact that they are married sub Albania, then we are not thereby, then we're giving them a reason to divorce sub Albania, but we are not giving Jim a reason to care about Alicia's emotional needs. Right? We convince them, marriage sub Albania, a bad thing. Okay, now divorce. Okay, so now they divorce, now they're strangers. So why should Jim care now about Alicia's emotional needs? He's not even married to her. By anybody's standards. Well, depending on whether divorce actually is possible. So I think it's hard for constructivists to give a special reason why Jim should care about Alicia's emotional needs. Of course, maybe you can give some general moral reasons why we should care about everybody's emotional needs. But why should Jim care about hers if the relationship he entered into with her is one that calls on him to ignore those needs? And that, I think, is implausible. I think Jim is probably being a bad husband. Now, I think that my main worry about this argument is how far a departure you can give and it still count as marriage. So I couldn't give a story where, you've got this relationship and it's constituted by two people throwing dishes at each other every day, and that is the only responsibility they have, is to throw dishes at each other, right? That wouldn't be marriage, even if they spoke English, mostly English, and used a word that sounded just like the word marriage for it. So I wanted to, this is sort of related to this worry of calling outliers. And for this case, you might have this worry that maybe if you've got too much ignoring of emotional needs, it's not a marriage. In the first version of this argument, when I was thinking about it, I said that the patriarchal society tells him to ignore all of his wife's needs. I thought, no, I'm no longer sure that they're even in the vicinity of marriage. But if it's a subset of the needs, the emotional ones, or maybe even a subset of the emotional ones, it seems like you can come up with a story on which we would want to call that marriage, and we would want to say he's being a bad husband. Next one. This one I fear will mostly convince the convinced. Though there may be a value to that, because giving sort of ways that the views cohere and fit together into a larger whole can still give some evidence for a view. I feel like, I'm kind of a romantic this way. I feel people tend to want to marry those they love romantically. And I think plausibly, apart from reasonable moral and practical restrictions, they should be able to do that. Big questions, right, as to what the moral and practical restrictions are and so on. A society that failed to meet this desire would be failing its people, and the force of this point is what drives a lot of the, I think, the support for same-sex marriage, is the thought that same-sex marriage doesn't violate reasonable moral and practical restrictions, and given that it does, if it does not, then a society that fails to meet people's desire to marry those they love romantically is a really bad thing for society to do. So I'm not assuming a case for or against same-sex marriage in this paper. I have a case, something like a case against in my One Body book, but it seems like this is an intuition that people on both sides of the debate can have. So unlike the next two arguments, one that both sides can like. And I think the best explanation for this, for why a society that fails to meet this desire is failing its people, is that the desire for marriage is a natural desire. Again, big set of questions. What are natural desires? What are non-natural ones? I have examples, right? The desire for food and beauty and virtue are natural desires. Maybe the desire for pleasure is also, I think that's also a natural desire. The desire for Xboxes is not a natural desire, though it might come from a natural desire for pleasure, say. But, so we can give cases. And I think there's in general no obligation for society to meet non-natural desires, maybe except as means to ends or something like that. But I feel this kind of idea that society should try to meet people's natural desires. It's also plausible to me that if the desire for marriage is natural, then marriage is natural as well. Again, that's a genuine leap here. Maybe that can be questioned. But if not, then we have another kind of case that there's a natural desire for marriage. Why? Because it's a desire that we really should be supporting people in as a society. It's not just some idiosyncratic desire. It's not something society has created. A society that doesn't provide an outlet for this desire will be failing. And this suggests that marriage is a natural kind. Okay. Now, on to the arguments that are going to convince, at most, a subset. Well, they're all like that, actually. But the two that sort of appeal to different audiences. So the first one is the conservative one. And the thought is, we should not limit access to constructed institutions on the grounds of gender, or maybe sex, without very strong reason when equivalents are not available. That seems a reasonable kind of thing. Test cases, sports competitions, for instance, we do limit access to women's teams to men and to men's teams to women. But precisely that's the kind of case when equivalents are available. Maybe you could argue that whether the equivalents are the same, say in a college setting, is football really a fair equivalent for equestrianism? I mean, equestrian is just so much more superior and so much better fitted to the human good. So it seems really unfair for the men to be excluded from it. You can make such particular cases, but the idea seems, the possibility of making such cases actually kind of strengthens the point. Bathrooms, again, controversial question these days, of course, but at least a case can be made that if everybody if you're dealing with a population where everybody has a clear binary gender or sex, then if you have equally accessible bathrooms for both sexes, equally convenient, equally clean, etc., then it's not a problem. But if you had just one, it would be a problem. Or if you had way more of one than of the other, then it might be a problem. So, if marriage is constructed, then marriage or an equivalent should be available to persons of the same gender. Now, there's a little bit of an issue here because you might think, yeah, but the previous one was about individual gender. Now it's about paired, the gender of pairs. But you can probably do this in terms of individuals. So, like, women are allowed to marry me. So, by this kind of principle, men should be allowed to do something equivalent to marrying me if marriage is constructed as a social institution. That means that those conservatives who deny the consequent, who deny the claim that marriage or an equivalent should be available to persons of the same gender or sex, should deny the antecedent, that marriage is constructed. That's the argument for them. And then the conservative should answer the call for equality as follows. Should say, in marriage, the state recognizes the presence of a natural kind of relationship, and this natural kind of relationship is never instanced in a same-sex case and cannot be. That's just the nature of it, just as water cannot be instanced by 4 atoms, or a water molecule cannot be instanced by 4 atoms. It can only be instanced by 3, sorry. And they must be of the right 3 sorts. That should be what they should say in response to arguments like that. Basically, the state shouldn't recognize what isn't there. What about the other side? Suppose, again, marriage is constructed. Suppose we are, as we no longer are, in a locality that doesn't allow same-sex marriage, but suppose we wanted to allow same-sex marriage, right? Wanted to, sort of a poor maybe choice of wording, right? Believe that it ought to, or believe that it ought to as a matter of justice or something like that. Well, by the assumption of constructivism, marriage is defined by normative complex. Moreover, we have supposed that this normative complex doesn't allow same-sex marriage. It requires an opposition of sexes, therefore. That's part of the normative complex, right? Social constructed institutions are defined among other normative things. I've never really given you a complete list of the normative factors by the entry and exit conditions for them. So, same-sex marriage is impossible if we understand marriage as marriage sub 1, the local thing, the local institution that we're talking about. It's just impossible. This is meant to be, right, so quick move at this point is you could just say, okay, liberal move, thing you could say is, this is obviously false, so we reject that marriage is constructed. That's the simpler version of this argument. But I want to go a little further and give a little bit of a more complicated argument. By considering some options, maybe what we could do, so yeah, granted, marriage, two people of the same sex, by definition, could not be married sub 1, because that's just not into entry conditions for marriage sub 1. And institutions are defined by their normative statuses and entry conditions and things like that. Could we replace marriage sub 1 with marriage sub 2, which would be more egalitarian? That wouldn't extend marriage sub 1. That would replace it. And if we replaced marriage sub 1, we would have to do one of two things. We would either have to grandfather all the people who were in a marriage sub 1 to stay in a marriage sub 1, or we would have to dissolve their marriage sub 1s. Neither option seems acceptable. The grandfathering option, I think, makes it impossible for something that seems socially quite important, that people be able to have the same relationships that their forebears have had. It would make it possible it would make it impossible for children to be in the same relationship that their parents were in. And the second option, of course, seems really problematic, the idea of divorcing everybody. I mean, it's been a standard refrain of the movement for legalizing same-sex marriage that it's not supposed to affect those in heterosexual marriages right now. So, seems like the replacement option isn't a great one. So we get ourselves into a bit of a pickle if we think that it's a social construction, and we want to revise it in this kind of a way. Now, if marriage, on the other hand, is a natural kind, then a revisionist who wants to extend it to same-sex cases can just say, revisionist relative to the particular society that I was imagining, where it's not permitted, can just say, well, the folks in this society were just wrong about the objective boundaries of this natural kind. This natural kind can, in fact, be instanced by people of the same sex, and they're wrong to say it couldn't be. Once you argue that, it's really easy to argue that the laws should be changed to get this right. I mean, the laws are now excluding this thing that is possible, the natural kind can cover, and so on. I do want to say one thing. There's one kind, I aimed one of the arguments at a conservative, the other at a liberal. That doesn't mean I got everybody, because I didn't get some people who like the same-sex union compromise. So somebody who could think we should have marriage and it should be only for people of the opposite sex, but we should have some equivalent to marriage that is open to people of the same sex. That view is not, somebody who holds that view can get out of both of the last two arguments I gave. They get out of the conservative side of the argument because they say we are offering an equivalent, and they get out of the liberal side by saying we're leaving marriage unchanged. We are just creating a new and equivalent institution for those of the same sex. I don't actually think this is maybe this is just a philosopher rather than politician or practical, reasonable person in me. I just don't feel like, this is a very good and satisfactory solution. It looks to me more like a practical political compromise. Seems to me that the conservative view that marriage should be restricted to people of the opposite sex, and the liberal view that it should be open to people regardless of whether they are of the same or of the other sex, those seem to be way, way better views to me than this compromise view. But again, you may argue otherwise. Okay, so we had 6 arguments, and I want to think about some different thought that I'm sure you were thinking about. The way I phrased a lot of these arguments is I was thinking of the constructivist view as making marriage indexical, indexed to a particular social package of rights, responsibilities, and other normative statuses. Sometimes I wrote sub-Elbonia or sub-USA and stuff like that. But here's a different constructivist picture, one that's a little bit more flexible, and the flexibility may help with some of the arguments. The idea is that marriage is any relationship with a marriage-like package of rights and responsibilities. Of course, anybody can make a view like that come out by just defining the marriage-like rights and responsibilities, however, so that it works, I guess. But I want to have a story that the constructivists can say about that. And then it's defined by a vague Wittgensteinian family resemblance, which is a bit of a cop-out, right? Because we're not saying exactly what the boundaries are. But sometimes this cop-out is what we should say, right? What defines an officer? That's across cultures and so on, and across different military structures. Well, some kind of fairly vague Wittgensteinian family resemblance. So we thought there's some kind of vague Wittgensteinian family resemblance. There is variation. There may be possible variation across marriage-like relationships in such things as the expectation of love, right? Some people claim. I'm actually somewhat skeptical of this, but some people claim that in, say, the Middle Ages in large parts of Europe, there wasn't that much of an expectation of romantic love. There might be variation in expectation of gender opposition, variation in expectations of binarity, and so on. But this is sort of a Wittgensteinian kind of thought. Maybe you couldn't have simultaneous variation in all these respects and still stay in the same family of relationships. So if it could be between 7 people, all of the same sex, none of whom care a whit for each other, it's not marriage. It's not marriage-like. And then maybe pragmatic and egalitarian considerations could make for us to want the state to recognize some marriages and not others, because maybe we care more about some of these packages and less about others. So it's a kind of loosey-goosey view that allows for a lot of flexibility. I think this view may escape the identification and revisionism arguments. So the identification argument was the one, people are crossing the border, do we count them as married? Well, we could say, yeah, no, well, it depends, right? It's what the lawyers say, it depends. It depends on how close is the package of rights and responsibilities in that culture to the one in our culture. Is it close enough to have a family resemblance? If it is, we'll count them as married. If not, we won't. It's maybe a similar kind of thing to the social construction question that you have when you have a foreigner entering Great Britain with a noble title, and the question is, at what level in the social precedence should they be counted with their foreign title of Graf, say, in Britain? And that shouldn't make you think that nobility is a natural kind. That is, nobility in the social sense, maybe nobility of character, I actually think might be a natural kind. But and the revisionism argument is also, I think, it will be damaged by this line of thought, because you could say, the liberal can say, yes, it's a different package, but we're not defining marriage by the particular package of rights and responsibilities, but by a family of but it's one of a family of resembling packages. And if you just change the gender opposition to allow for gender sameness, you still are close enough. That doesn't matter. And I think actually a lot of people do think something like this line of thought about that case. I'm not completely sure that this fully solves the identification problem. There's still sort of this fairness worry. What do you do at the border for these people who are entering? Now, they seem to have acquired new duties. It seems kind of duties they never thought about when they were getting married. It seems a little unfair. Maybe that's pragmatic. On the other hand, I think that even on this family resemblance story, the discovery view, the critique, the natural desire, and the conservatism arguments remain. I think quite a number of the arguments remain. On this family resemblance view, for instance, the critique one is actually, I find to have a lot of force for me. The Elbonian can say, yes, my thing is marriage sub Elbonia. Now we get to add this additional thing that marriage sub Elbonia is similar enough to marriage sub USA. Yeah, but that still doesn't let us do what we actually think we should be able to do, is criticize Jim for mistreating his wife. Because she's not his wife sub USA, she's his wife sub Elbonia. And the rights and responsibilities do not come from the family of relationships, but they come from the particular member of the family of relationships, because the family of relationships is defined by varying the rights and responsibilities. So I think a number of the arguments still remain on this Wittgensteinian picture. Some concluding thoughts. We can make mistakes when extending the boundaries of what we think falls under a natural kind, a common phenomenon. We can make mistakes when failing to extend the boundaries of what we think falls under a natural kind. This is sort of related to the liberal and conservative things. There is a genuine room for genuine debate, right? If you've got a natural kind, what does and does not fall into it? Seeing marriage as a natural kind should lead us to serious investigation of what constitutes this kind, and allows for the conceptual possibility of criticisms of social conventions that don't do justice to the objective norms falling under that natural kind. And so I think that marriage as a natural kind should be agreed on across ideological divides, but of course, then there will be the question of what this natural kind is like. Thank you.